So it's not that there are new revelations in this book. It's really just an insider's view into what's going on from the firsthand accounting inside the White House. We all know that what was going on based on reporting, and now it's the people inside telling us what's going on.
Book tying it all together. Rachel Bovard, let me just get your reaction to this apology this morning and help me understand here the role that you think Steve Bannon's going to play going forward. He was solidly in the fold of the Trump administration, excommunicated here over these last few days. Is this going to be enough to bring him back into the fold, if only partially, and give him some more influence with the Republican Party?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, President Trump famously accepts groveling as a means of apology, so I do think that we'll see a little bit more of that from Steve Bannon. But I do think Bannon has been instrumental in some respects in taking Trumpism and making it a message that resonates with people. So, you know, the extent that he still continues to do that, that's going to be a matter for the president to decide. But I do think it's possible you see him back in the fold in the near future, assuming there's enough groveling in between.
David Jolly, about that word, that neologism, Trumpism. Do we have a definition of it, and how much of that definition is it created by Steve Bannon?
It is Steve Bannon, and listen, it's no secret these two are going to make up, and they're going to be a team going into 2018, where Donald Trump lusts for fame, Steve Bannon lusts for raw power, and he knows that comes by being close to Donald Trump. And they share these sympathies for the alt-right, they share these sympathies for neo-nationalism, and ultimately what Steve Bannon can do, and this is very important. Listen, there have been people who have questioned the reporting in Michael Wolff's book, and he stands by it, but there have been people who have questioned it. The early story coming out of this book is all about what Steve Bannon said about Donald Trump. It's all about Steve Bannon distancing himself from Trump, criticizing the Trump family. If Steve Bannon is the one person who begins to say, none of that's true, I didn't say that, then it comes time for Michael Wolff to play tapes or not, and it will allow Donald Trump to continue this beratement of Michael Wolff.
David Jolly, I want to play a bit of an exchange here that Stephen Miller, the domestic policy advisor to President Trump, had with Jake Tapper on CNN this morning. He came out defending the president, talking a bit about Steve Bannon. Let's take a listen to what he had to say in what was a very heated exchange, again, with Jake Tapper on CNN.
The book is best understood as a work of very poorly written fiction. And I also will say that the author is a garbage author of a garbage book. The portrayal of the president in the book is so contrary to reality, to the experience of those who work with him, to my own experience having spent the last 2 years with him.
Okay, that continued for about 12 minutes. David Jolly, let me just ask you about the president's tack here. He's talking about this book a lot. He's engaging with what's in the book, what's being said about him in the book. By all accounts, that's adding to the sales of the book, the popularity of it. What do you make of that strategy? How wise is it for this president to keep engaging with it?
Oh, it's very unwise, but look, they smell blood, and that's Stephen Miller trying to demonstrate he can be a stable genius, to use the president's terminology. But Stephen Miller is also the one person in this White House, through loyalty and sycophancy, that can fill Steve Bannon's shoes, and he knows that. The Stephen Miller interview was for an audience of one. It was for Donald Trump, and we saw that with Donald Trump immediately tweeting out what a great job Stephen Miller did. Listen, the alt-right tendencies, this neo-nationalism that is the Bannon-Trump doctrine, doesn't change just because Bannon leaves the White House. It is the only clinging to power that Donald Trump is able to do to keep his base happy, and he knows that. Without it, he's nothing.
Mr. Alito, so much of the focus here has been on the president's mental stability or acuity, in part because he keeps talking about it. But something else that's a through line through this book is his engagement with policy decisions, what he cares about, what he holds as dear or important. What did you take away from looking through this book about that, about the role of policy in this administration and to this president?
Well, essentially, the president will agree on policy if you've told him something 5 minutes ago. And so one of the things that we've seen, not just in the reporting, but also in this book, is that President Trump essentially will argue for whoever 5 minutes ago told him that position was correct. And so that is a very troubling thing, because we know by watching the president that he does not understand policy or the underlying details that go into making policy. But to the overall question about this book, the existence of this book and the access that Michael Wolff got to these folks inside the White House is evidence of the argument and thesis presented in the book. The incompetence that is demonstrated in this book is evident of the fact that he had the access in the first place. As a former comm staffer from the Hillary campaign, I cannot believe that they allowed this reporter to essentially hang out inside the White House and just essentially be a fly on the wall. No press staffer said, "Why is that reporter here? Why is he here? Is he on the record?" Does he have a recorder? Is he taking notes? Those are basic level questions. So the fact that he's documenting the incompetence is evidenced by the fact that he got the access in the first place.
Rachel Bovard, on that point, you've got the book presenting this portrait of the president, how he acts and what he cares about, and it's also a picture of the dysfunction that Zerlina just mentioned within the White House. What do you make of the fact that when you listen to President Trump since the publication of this book, so little of his attention seems to be centered on that, on defending the way his administration works or doesn't?
Well, I think Michael Wolff crossed a lot of lines when he went after the president's family, and I don't think anyone can blame President Trump for being angry about that. You know, I think Michael Wolff blends fact and fiction. It's very difficult to know what's actually true and what's made up. He told the Washington Post in 2001 that he will say anything, and I think there's a lot of credibility problems with this book. But I think more than that, you know, when you look at the president's policy process, what's actually come out of this White House in the last year, it's been mammoth for a first-year president. And so I think people also need to take that into account. He has done almost everything he said he was going to do on the campaign trail, and that's not reflective, you know, of what Michael Wolff presents. What we've seen is actually reflective of a coherent strategy, a policy staff that's competent, and I think the results speak for themselves. So as far as I'm concerned, that Michael Wolff book is tabloid fodder.
David Jolly, I want you to have you respond to that as we look ahead here to 2018. And we see all the open questions about DACA and immigration. He still talks about the wall, all the policy priorities he's not been able to get to. Where do you see us going from here?
He didn't repeal and replace Obamacare. We didn't see a populist-based tax reform that benefits every family. We didn't have Mexico pay for the wall. There are things that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell got done that this president can take credit for, and yes, can draw contrast with Democrats going in. But here's the telling part of Michael Wolff's book. And listen, he did much of this on deep background, which provides a great challenge for an author of a book. But here's the most telling point about all of this. The president himself is being questioned about his mental fitness. And in politics, if you're explaining, you ain't campaigning. If he is having to defend his mental fitness before the American people and the world stage, he has lost the message, he is losing the American people, and he is doing very poorly entering a midterm election year.
Zerlina, if he has to do that, does he have to do it? Does this have to continue? How do you see this ending as we look ahead to legislators coming back to Washington this week, having to deal with immigration, looking ahead to the prospects of a government shutdown in, what, 12 days? Is this going to continue to dog him up until that point?
Absolutely. And I think that with Robert Mueller continuing to work, because as we sit here today, Robert Mueller is working and his team is working. And so as long as the Russia threat and the investigation hangs over the head of the president, he's going to be acting more erratically, because it's clear that with the indictments and the plea agreements we've seen so far, he's getting closer and closer and closer to the top man, and that definitely is making the president feel some sort of stress. Now, somebody who is mentally stable is not going to tweak things that could potentially lead us closer to war with North Korea. So I think that there's enough evidence in the president's own behavior that leads us to question his mental stability, regardless of what's in this book.
Rachel Bovard, last question to you here just about the relationship between the White House and Republican leadership within the Congress. Looking at that press conference yesterday, I was studying the facial expressions of those who were there behind him. I'm sure many of them wouldn't have elected to be there as the president mounted this fulsome defense of his mental acuity. What's that relationship like? Are you confident here going forward there's a seamless connection between the president and members of Congress, members of his own party in Congress, on agenda items like DACA, like immigration, like funding for the government going forward?
You know, I think that relationship is always challenging between the president and his party leadership, but it's interesting because going back to what Congressman Jolly said about, you know, Trump not being able to repeal and replace Obamacare, a non-populist tax reform, those are things Congress failed to get done, not the president. And so I think, you know, Trump has delivered on his promises, and so I think to the extent that the congressional leadership can take a cue from Trump, that would be good. I think Congress has failed to deliver on a number of things. They're going to need to step it up in 2018 if they're going to get face the headwinds that are coming in the 2018 midterms, and I think Trump and the leadership are committed to doing that together. So I do think on that front, they're going to be working hand in hand a little bit more this year than they have been.
All right, Richard Bovard,
if I may.
Yeah, David Jolly, very quickly.
Look, that's the cult of personality that is Trumpism. He gets all the credit for things that got done. Congress gets all the blame for things that didn't. That is Trumpism, period.
All right, David Jolly, the former congressman, thank you very much for the time. Zerlina Maxwell, Rachel Bovard, thanks to you as well. And still ahead, legal action, President Trump's attempt to keep the fire and fury from hitting store shelves, and whether we could see a lawsuit.
I consider it a work of fiction, and I think it's a disgrace that somebody's able to have something, do something like that.
It's 6 a.m. 40 million Americans are waking up to a Gillette shave. And at our factory in Boston, 1,200 workers are starting their day building on over 100 years of heritage, craftsmanship, and innovation. Today, we're bringing